they will not leave disappointed. This guy is unique, special, and we are privileged to be here today.
Wanted to jump back in with a couple of thoughts here. The Washington Wizards traded 2 second-round picks to the Houston Rockets for Cam Whitmore. I think that this is an interesting trade for both teams, right? It starts with, I want to actually start on the Houston side of things. I'm curious to see how the Rockets sort of build out their roster after this point, right? The Rockets have had a big offseason in terms of acquiring talent. They've been adding big men to the roster, whether it's Kevin Durant, Clint Capella. They re-sign Steven Adams. They go and get Dorian Finney-Smith from the Los Angeles Lakers. There's a lot of size on this roster, but there's not a lot of guards when you look at it, right? It's Fred VanVleet, Reed Shepherd, I guess you would count Amin Thompson, Jonathan Williams, and Aaron Holiday. I think the first thing in my mind here is that Kevin Durant's effectively a shooting guard on this roster, right? You're probably going to play him at that spot. You're going to put several good defenders around him and then just kind of allow him to do Kevin Durant things. But I am interested in what the Rockets look at as their weaknesses for the rest of the offseason. Someone mentioned Chris Paul as a potential opportunity guy for them. I don't see that happening. I just think Fred VanVleet's locked in at that spot. But I would love to see them get another guard, maybe another two, just to be on the safe side. But it is an interesting point to make. The Rockets kind of needed to make this trade. They kind of have too many bodies, and I think Cam kind of played out his welcome there. Once you start figuring that you have Jabari Smith Jr. signed to an extension, you got Tari Eason coming up on an extension. You have Durant for the next couple seasons. You have guys like Finney-Smith, as we mentioned. Jason Tate, they just re-signed on a one-year deal. Jeff Green's more of a veteran on the bench, right? But I'm curious to see ultimately what Houston does with the back end of their roster and if they can add another good guard or two. But ultimately, this trade kind of needed to happen because the Rockets just had too many young players and they are now pivoting to winning. So you take some of the guys that you're not going to keep and try to flip them for long-term assets, right? The Washington Wizards are interesting to me. One of the trades we didn't talk about on the channel was the Jordan Poole for CJ McCollum deal. Ultimately, that deal is veteran based. It gets him another veteran to go with Chris Middleton and Marcus Smart. And it opens up a whole bunch of cap space for the Wizards in the next couple of years, which I think is important, right? This trade, the Cam Whitmore deal, gives them another young talent for the Wizards to work with. You put him alongside Alex Sarr, Bilal Coulibaly, Bub Carrington. They did a trade where they acquired Will Riley. They have A.J. Johnson, who was a breakout guy last year. They got Keyshawn George, who looked really good last year as a defensive player. Added Dylan Jones in a trade a couple days ago from the Oklahoma City Thunder. They just have a lot of young guys. Justin Champagny, another guy. They have a ton of young talent here. And I guess what I'm interested in is how they kind of figure out which ones to keep, right? Whitmore and Coulibaly are the first set of guys that are going to be extension eligible. I think Bub and Sarr probably have the easier paths to playing time and consistent development. Carrington, now, even with Marcus Smart, McCollum, and Middleton on the roster, I still think there's just going to be an area where you play Bub and he's going to get a ton of minutes. Alex Sarr is probably one of the best bigs on the roster. You have optimal big men to play alongside him now that he wants to play the five. You can play Kelly Olynyk alongside him. You can play Rashawn Holmes aside him. And those lineups will be perfectly fine for a team that is still developing and figuring things out, right? Ultimately, in the beginning, I wasn't a fan of that Wizards trade because of the Wizards Hornets trade. Well, Wizards Pelicans. Let's try that for a third time. Because I thought Jordan Poole was good last year. So I didn't really understand dumping the it looked like a dumping of the contract, which I think it still is, because one of the things that were lauded after the trade was the Wizards having almost $100 million in cap space, right? But ultimately, I think where the Wizards are going now is that they're going to try to figure out all these young guys and figure out what they have. And ultimately, I'm curious to see who steps up out of that group. Because what happened for me personally for the Wizards is that I think they set themselves up to be like the perfect Cooper Flag team, and then it didn't happen. So you start looking at the roster and you're looking at the data of their young players, and you don't see a lot, right? Like Koulibaly is entering a potential contract year where they can extend him, and he's okay. Like he's probably a number three guy if everything clicks. Bob Carrington looked good. Alex Sarr, I think the statistical profile was good, but like the advanced metrics and just his overall performance, like I feel like he had a couple of games where he was just getting destroyed by more talented big men, but that'll happen to you when you're a 19-year-old, 20-year-old guy coming into the league. I'm curious how the Wizards play this out and who gets the shots. I'm curious to see what they do with Corey Kispert, who I think is on a good contract and teams could use him. Are you going to flip him for future draft picks? Are you going to try to find another young piece to throw into the mix? I think the Wizards are in an interesting spot here because they have a shot to get the number one pick, to get a lot of young talent moving forward. They're going to be contesting for a lottery pick this year. So I believe you're going to see Middleton, McCollum, Smart either bought out or traded. You know, Kispert's another one that could be traded. Olynyk, Holmes, these guys can all be moved. But I ultimately wonder what comes of that with the Wizards, because I just think you have so much young talent on the board that eventually you kind of have too much young talent. And I feel like we're kind of hitting that point, right? The Wizards have a ton of draft picks. They'll figure things out. I think before the trade they had about 16 second round picks, so this knocks them down a bit. But ultimately, I'm curious to see how Cam deals in Washington. I'm curious to see what the future holds for all these guys because they're all a bit duplicative at the moment. So I think the Wizards are moving in the right direction. The history of the Wizards, at least the last 25 years minimum, is that they really didn't have a plan, right? There really wasn't like the post John Wall era. They really haven't had a plan. It was just kind of adding talent, trading guys. They kind of just floated in the league. Now under Dawkins and Michael Winger, you kind of have a group of guys trying to add a bunch of young talent to really an underdeveloped market. Washington should be considered a big market in the NBA, and it just never really had a chance to shine like that, right? So you're adding all these young talents, you're building up, you're hoping for one or two or three of these guys to hit. Meanwhile, you have all this cap space on the other side of the table where maybe a player axes out, maybe there's an opportunity to trade for somebody who's disgruntled, and maybe there's an opportunity for you to jump into a trade. You can, with these new rules in the second apron and everyone trying to avoid, financial penalties, you now have $100 million to maybe collect a player, take a player in, add some future assets. I think the Nets process is always the worst process because you never want to have too many draft picks. You want to be in the middle, right? So the Nets process, to me, I don't like it because there's too many draft picks, there's too many unknowns, there's too many ping pong balls involved in this situation. Meanwhile, the Wizards probably have too many players on the roster, and you can't give all these guys the necessary time to play and develop. So the best answer is somewhere in the middle. I think right now it's easier for the Wizards to get into the middle, acquire a couple draft picks, future draft picks, acquire some veteran players they can keep on the roster for salary purposes or for future trades. But this is step one to me, right? And I wish they got the number one pick in the draft so they can get Cooper Flag so we have a legitimate star level talent. But right now they have a bunch of options and they're going to throw a bunch of things at the wall. They're going to be bad next year, but a lot of talent's on this roster. And I'm curious to see over the next 2 or 3 years how this plays out. And that X factor of having all that cap space, I wonder if the right player hits, how do the Wizards move on adding to that player? So ultimately, I think Cam Whitmore is a good move here. It's a good shot. 2 second round picks for a look at Whitmore for the next 2 seasons. But ultimately, I'm kind of nervous about Washington having too many players. And I'm also interested moving forward in how Houston kind of shapes out the roster, specifically in the guard spots at the end of this. So I think both teams did okay. I just wanted to give my opinion on that, and I'm curious to watch them both next season. What are your takes? Drop them in the comments below. Thank you for listening.